Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Bob Hathaway. I have the privilege of directing the Asia program here. Since we have at least a few unfamiliar faces in the audience, but particularly since this is being webcast live, and I expect there are people perhaps in India or elsewhere around the world who may not know the Wilson Center. Let me just tell you that the Woodrow Wilson Center is the nation's official memorial to President Wilson. President Wilson is the only American president with a PhD. He had a long and distinguished academic career before becoming governor of the state of New Jersey, and from that position then became president, served for 8 years as president early in the 20th century. The Wilson Center seeks to focus on President Wilson's twin passions of public policy and scholarly excellence. We seek to bring into the same room scholars and academics who are doing leading research on issues of importance in a wide variety of fields, and have them interact with policymakers both from the United States and from other countries around the world. And I think this meeting today is a good example of our efforts to achieve that particular purpose. Our program today is jointly sponsored by the Wilson Center and FICCI, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. We are delighted to be working with FICCI. This is our first partnership, but not, I trust, our last partnership with FICCI. I want to particularly acknowledge the wonderful work and help from FICCI's Assistant Secretary General for FICCI's operations here in the United States, Ranjana Khanna, down here on the first row. Ranjana, as you know better than anyone, this would not have happened without you, and we are delighted to be working with you and with FICCI on today's program. I also want to thank our Wilson Center partners in the program on Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy, or STAGE as that program is known here, and especially the STAGE director, Kent Hughes, for co-sponsoring this program with us, with my Asia program, and particularly for helping us in the conceptualization and organization of this conference today. I also want to acknowledge and to thank the members of the Asia program staff, and especially Bhumika Machala, who's sitting in the very back, and who played perhaps the key role on our side in putting this conference together, as well as Michael Kugelman. I think Michael may be outside right now, but he too deserves a great deal of credit. As many of you are aware, we had originally planned to have the Indian finance minister with us today. He had to cancel his trip to Washington at the last moment, which of course was a great disappointment. But in his place, we had the extraordinarily good fortune to get one of India's leading businessmen, Bharat Wakhlu, to step in. I'll have more to say about Mr. Wakhlu in just a minute, but I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge how very much we are in his debt, and particularly how much we appreciate him rearranging his schedule at very short notice so that he could be with us today. Finally, I want to thank our other speakers, each of whom will be introduced later in the morning. We're grateful for their participation, and I expect that all of us will leave this room later today much the wiser for having had the opportunity to listen to them. Our topic today, as you know, is a vast one. Nothing less than an exploration of the forces of globalization that are shaping the world in which we live. We will examine how these forces are transforming India from an impoverished third world nation, largely divorced from the global economic system, into what everyone agrees has become one of the world's most dynamic countries, with one of the world's most dynamic and fastest growing economies. At the same time, I think we need to guard against uncritical cheerleading and give due attention to the issues of inclusive and equitable economic growth that are increasingly becoming part of the discussion on globalization. As one component of globalization, the commercial and economic relationship between the United States and India has substantially increased in recent years, particularly in the service and IT sectors. We'll be talking about that later in the morning, and I think part of our discussion today might well focus on how this bilateral economic relationship ought to evolve in the years ahead in order to benefit both countries, and also to benefit a wide cross-section of the populations of the United States and India. Finally, and at the risk of overflowing an already full plate, we might well take a look during the course of the day at the role of the private sector in both countries. The role the private sector might well play in many of these developments that we will be talking about, as well as the interaction between the private sector and the government in both countries. So we have a full agenda, and I propose we go ahead and get started. We are going to first hear from Bharat Wakhlu. He is the president of Tata Incorporated, headquartered in New York, which is the American arm of Tata Group, one of India's largest, oldest, and most distinguished business groups. Mr. Wakhlu has had a long experience working with companies in the Tata Group prior to coming to New York in 2003 to take his current position. But in addition to being recognized as one of India's most prominent and influential businessmen, he has a number of other interests, which I'll briefly mention simply to give you a sense of the full measure of this man. He is, first of all, the author of a best-selling book entitled Total Quality: Excellence Through Organization-Wide Transformation, which was published some years ago, but the demand for which has been sufficiently great so that just earlier this year it has been reprinted. He has also published over 40 articles and papers on issues ranging from leadership to quality and corporate performance improvement to socially responsible investing to public administration. He is also, he tells me this is what he does for his nighttime job, he's also now in the last stages of finishing a novel. And lastly, and he doesn't know I'm going to say this about him, there's been considerable speculation that at one point he may also enter the rough and tumble world of Indian politics. So we are extremely fortunate to have a impressive speaker with us this morning, as in fact the first of several impressive speakers. So Bharat, I turn things over to you, and we're delighted to have you here.
you, Bob. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This introduction of yours obviously showed me that the Wilson Center does its research rather thoroughly. And there are quite a few snippets of information which frankly took me by surprise as well. Anyway, a very good morning to all of you. I'm really delighted to be speaking at the Wilson Center. I would like to thank the Wilson Center and especially Vicky for arranging this seminar on a topic which I think has extraordinary relevance, not just for India, but for the entire world. And the reason is, and that's part of my thesis for today's talk, we are living in a highly interconnected world. And we are at a stage where whatever happens in one part of the world is bound to impact the rest of the world. And a lot of people talk about India and China as if they're two distinct entities with some connections because of trade flows and so on and so forth. But my contention and my strong thesis is really this, that for the well-being of the world as a whole and for the economic development of all people around the world, it is not so much about whether India does better than China or whether China does better than India, but how the whole world, the developed world as well as the developing world, work closely together to tide over the challenges and use the opportunities available from both these nations to forge a system or forge an arrangement which brings out the over 50% of the world's population that is currently living below poverty. So the issue really is of in a connected world, we've got to figure out ways and means to find what is the best way forward. And I think there could not be a more insightful discussion than to understand exactly what makes India tick, what are the challenges, and similarly, what makes China tick, what are the challenges there, and then figuring out the best ways to use that information to come up with something which has a lasting impact and a benefit for people around the world, both in the developing world as well as in the developed world. So really, this is going to be the thesis of my talk today, and I really think it's a wonderful opportunity to be here today. A lot of people ask me this question. They say, where has India been all these decades? India has been around for a long time, and those of you who have an interest in culture and history would know that India is a land where we at least have archaeological evidence that goes back about 3,000 or 4,000 years in time. We have recorded history that goes back a few thousand years. And yet, India seems to have sprung up like a mushroom out of the blue, and a lot of people wonder, where have you guys been if there is so much that's happening good for India? Well, to which my answer really has been that India has been, it was kind of forced to lie dormant for a long, long time. And let me explain what I mean by that. When the East India Company was set up by Queen Elizabeth I in the early part of the 17th century, India accounted for close to 33% of the contribution to global trade. By the time India became independent in 1947, this figure had reduced to 4%. So what do you think happened? A good friend of mine who's also a comedian says, when Britain ruled the waves, they waved the rules. And economic independence was one of the first things that was curtailed. And obviously when you curtail how business gets done, even the most entrepreneurial nation, as India is really, was stymied, and we therefore had to suffer the tragic consequences of low economic development. Now, intrinsically also, if we were to look at India as a nation, India has certain significant advantages which make it a natural as a nation which would grow strong economically. For instance, it has an enormous coastline, which makes it easy for global trade. It has natural resources in abundance, forests cover, mineral wealth, iron ore, not much oil and natural gas. Natural gas, yes, but not too much oil. It has a highly skilled set of people, right? As of today, almost 750,000 scientists and engineers graduate every year, which is even higher than the US and higher than China. And we have navigable rivers. We have a very entrepreneurial set of people. We have a history of non-aggression and diversity and tolerance. So these are factors which, if you were to put on the table and say, okay, what is it that India has? You'd say India obviously possesses a lot of factors which make it an automatic region which should be growing economically. And to my mind, that is what's showing up right now. It is these factors, among others, which are obviously having a very, very major impact. The good news is also that since 1990, we have also been reforming our economy. And I think we all know that Mr. Manmohan Singh, the current Prime Minister, he was the finance minister in 1991 when India was going through a terrible problem. And he was the one who actually helped set into motion the reform process, which at that time was also supported by Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia and the current finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram. So you really have a wonderful team at the top of the helm of affairs, so to say, in India right now, which makes it so much more easy for the process to move forth without any hassles. The other thing about the reform process is that even though there have been changes in regimes and governments have changed, parties have changed, nobody has touched the reform process at all, which clearly goes to show that people understand that intrinsically the reform process is here to stay and people appreciate the benefits. Now, what's been the consequences of the reform process and the intrinsic strengths of India? Obviously, apart from the fact that we have a democratic way of governance, we have an English-speaking crowd that exceeds the number of people in the US and Britain. We have a high level of disposable income in the Indian middle class, which creates a lot of consumption domestically. In fact, consumption in India as a proportion of GDP was close to 59% as against 38% in China. So intrinsic consumption in India is also a very, very important part. It's a land with independent judiciary, a free press, and a whole host of factors which make for the involvement of many large groups of people in the process of reform and economic development. The macroeconomic fundamentals, how do they look? Pretty robust. In 1991-92, the GDP growth was a mere 5.2%. As of March of the current financial year, it was close to 9%, which is a significant improvement. Forex reserves, when the reform process began, was close to $2 billion. Now it's close to $200 billion, a major increase. Fiscal deficit has fallen from 5.5% in 91-92 to almost 3.6% now. Debt has fallen from 28.7% of GDP in 91-92 to a mere 15.8% now. So the macroeconomic fundamentals are looking good. The trends are positive. What about the microeconomic fundamentals? The microeconomic fundamentals, let's look at the markets. Well-governed, liquid, well-regulated. A slew of world-class private companies. Unlike China, where many of the corporations that we hear about or which are in the news are largely state-owned enterprises, in India we have corporations like those in the Tata Group, Reliance, Wipro, and a whole host of them in the pharmaceutical sector and many other sectors, which are really contributing to the creation of wealth. And I think that, coupled with the intrinsic entrepreneurial spirit of India, is one of the best and the most robust indicators of a good microeconomic standing as well. Now, having said this, let me just move to another slide. This is for those of you who don't know about India. This is what the country looks like. I've touched upon some of the opportunities. Obviously, the opportunities are very, very many. The fact remains that we have a long way to go. A lot of you who have been hearing talks about India would hear that there are skeptics who say that, oh, the infrastructure is pretty weak. It's nowhere near China's. You don't see spanking new towns coming up like Shanghai and so on, which is true. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly the opportunity. We have a situation where more investment, more funding, better management of these funds and better governance can certainly create a difference. And I'll be speaking about this in some more detail. But at the same time, there are challenges. And the challenges are many. And for those of you who might wonder why I've used flying geese to link up with challenges, the reason is there's a mnemonic hidden in this. And I have, after much research and much deliberation, I have come to the conclusion that there are 5 distinct concerns that India needs to be aware about. And why are these concerns especially relevant? Because we are today, as I mentioned up front, living in an interconnected world where our fortunes are interlinked. We are no longer living in a situation where if something happens in one part of the world, the rest of the world is immune. I think today, whether it's health, global security, economic development, and so on, we've got to appreciate the interlinkages across nations around the world. Now, this might sound like a bit of a surprise. You know, on the one hand, there is this endeavor to ensure that within national boundaries, economic growth happens. But at the same time, we understand that trade and commerce and going beyond the boundaries is one of the more powerful ways of creating economic wealth. So there are 2 contrary forces, but I think that's exactly the challenge which we need to look at. But specifically, coming back to the case of India, I would like to mention these 5 challenges before us. Number 1, governance. A lot of people have discussed with me, those of my friends who've seen this presentation say, no, governance is not the issue. They say infrastructure should be the issue. But I quite disagree, and I'll tell you why as we go forward. The second thing is energy and resources. The third is equity. I think Bob briefly mentioned this, but I think that is a very, very major concern. Dr. Mitra from the FICCI, who speaks often here in the US, has also mentioned that the need for inclusion of those who are living on the peripheries of India's economic development, that's a very, very crucial requirement. And I put it down as equity. Security is a very important concern. Security, and I'll explain these points in detail as we go forward. And finally, ecology. I think now it's time for us to go over these points very, very clearly because interestingly, if we do not look at these issues and if we don't find solutions to these issues, we're bound to ensure that there's going to be a lot of disruption because these are the kind of things that if you don't attack them, there is bound to be concern and there's bound to be disruptive forces getting unleashed, which can have an impact across the globe. So let's take a look at what each of these things really stands for. Governance in India has been talked about a great deal. Any article you pick up on India will say, oh, India is such a rough and tumble kind of a place with democracies being so noisy, and you have the panchayat at the grassroots level, and you have the wheeling and dealing of political parties at the very top. This is a fact. Indian democracies are noisy, they are slow to take decisions. It's very unlike the Chinese model, but that's the whole point. The Indian model is distinctly different. Yet, the challenge really is that is the political system sufficiently robust or is it fragile? Is it that the leaders today have not created a band of leaders beneath them? Is it likely that the structure that we follow right now where caste and money and other kinds of influences affect voting, could that be an issue which might undermine the whole thing? My response to that is no. These are concerns, but I'm reminded of the Malthusian doomsday experts in the 1960s when India was still coming out of independence. A lot of people would say, oh, India is going to be growing with a large population, the food grains would run out and so on. So I think the naysayers right now probably are in the same mood. The good news is at the panchayat level, at the grassroots level, you have many more women who are participating, even though panchayats have a reservation of about 30% for women. The actual numbers of women at the panchayat level is close to 45%. And they're making a difference. You can talk to, there's a long way to go still, but there are things that are changing. The other interesting thing is that the Government of India passed a bill very recently, which is the Right to Information Bill. And today, people are demanding to know what's happening on projects that the government is responsible for. How is money being spent? How are the contractors being identified? How are the people being, assigned to certain jobs? I think, to my mind, that is one of the greatest strengths that India has, and this is partly an opportunity for us to channelize that energy to make sure that the governance improves. As an example, let me also explain to you how one of the Tata companies, Tata Consultancy Services, is actually involved with helping the government make the transition from a bureaucratic, human-led governance system to an e-governance system. In 200 districts in India, TCS has developed software which enables people to monitor how the 100 days of mandatory work, which are to be assigned to people below a certain poverty level, are managed. So by the touch of a button on the computer, you can actually get to see how people who are to be assigned work are given to work for 100 days. So there's a great deal of focus on empowerment, and I think that's definitely a very, very major issue. And businesses, of course, have to be very, very watchful. In the desire to move forward, there might be concerns about, short-circuiting the bureaucracy by using unethical means to move forward. I think that is a big mistake, and that would be counterproductive. So I think in the governance issue, empowerment of people is important, not falling or not succumbing to this racket of graft wherever it exists, and it does exist in certain pockets, and empowerment of people through education, and strengthening democracy by making the political system more robust and deeper is probably some of the things that would help India to tide over the challenges of governance. And the moment you take care of this, infrastructure is bound to fall into place. It's not because, you see, after all, infrastructure is if you do a survey across the country, why are projects not getting done quickly? We have a few shining examples like the Delhi Metro, for instance. The Golden Quadrilateral is getting done. The airports in Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Delhi are now getting done. But about the rest of them, the reasons are the lack of political will. And that needs a change. That needs people's power to be pressing on the politicians. That needs the kind of emphasis which is so essential for making change. The second point, of course, is ecology. We've come to a stage in India where if India were to adopt the same kind of consumptive patterns that the Western world has adopted, we would need 6 or 7 ecosystems the size of planet Earth to sustain that kind of consumption. So you can see it's utterly unsustainable. What does that mean? That means India will have to forge a process of development which is sustainable, which is long-term, and which benefits people. It does not deprive them of the benefits of economic growth, but it is something which is sustainable over the long term. Obviously, a focus on renewable sources of energy, recycling, management of waste, even the control of pollution, ozone depletion, and water resources have to be very, very cleverly harnessed, because to my mind that could otherwise impede our growth, and the rates of growth that we are projecting into the future can be greatly upset if that doesn't get done. An attendant issue is also about agriculture. Today, agriculture accounts for a mere 20% of India's GDP. And yet 80% of India lives in the villages and is dependent on agriculture. So there has to be a way to make sure that on the one hand, we are able to enhance agricultural productivity, enhance that the contribution of agriculture through productive improvements is higher, and at the same time we provide greater rural reform, rural infrastructure to make sure that the rural workforce is able to engage in more productive agriculture, in sustainable agriculture, and ensure that the requirements of that large population are also adequately met. The third issue, of course, is of energy and natural resources. I think this is something which a lot of people worry about, because one of the attendant ideas of globalization is a tremendous demand for commodities, a tremendous demand for resources around the world. And I think we all need to appreciate that it is true that industry is driven by energy. It's driven by commodities being imported from wherever they exist in the world. But I think we've got to appreciate that there are certain limitations on the indiscriminate and the wanton use of energy and natural resources. Which is why, when in the context of India, India has been pushing very, very hard for the civilian nuclear agreement with the United States. And for those of you who might not be aware of why we've been after it so strongly, you got to appreciate that today India derives much of its power from thermal sources. And India has a chronic deficit of power. We need the power to get people out of poverty because industrialization requires energy. If we were to use the coking coal and the non-coking coal that we have in India, we would be spewing out tons and tons of carbon, which would not only affect India, but it would affect the entire globe, because global warming, ladies and gentlemen, is a reality. And the more the large populous countries get involved in the same kind of development that we see around the world, we might actually be doing more harm than good. So the nuclear deal is a good deal. It has got to be done. It's also going to be done. It ought to be done. I hear that there are some little hiccups in the process. I know probably Aziz and Dr. Sazawal can help throw more light as we go along. But the fact is, this is something which is good for the world, and I think it ought to happen. So at the same time, of course, natural resources will have to be managed in a more equitable fashion. Today, there is a demand for energy, there's a demand for oil, and a variety of other commodities. There will have to be a way to assign or provide these in a way that is equitable and appropriate, so that everybody is able to benefit from them, and not just one region or one specific economy. The fourth point, of course, is security. You all know that India is kind of located in a very, very tough neighborhood. There are concerns about India being a democratic country with a lot of non-democratic nations around us, which can cause tensions, it can cause a little friction. But I think it is in our collective interest to understand that for India to be able to grow, the rest of the region has to grow as well. And I think, therefore, it is important that India is able to take a role in making sure that concerns related to the neighborhood countries are also adequately addressed. The other issue is India has a large youthful population. In fact, and that many people call that the demographic dividend, because we would have, while the rest of the world, especially Japan and the Western world, would be aging, India would be having a sizable proportion of its workforce in the working age. But the working age also coincides with the sexually active age, and therefore HIV and AIDS can be an issue which needs to be managed. Migrations across boundaries between states, a lot of global travel and so on makes it even more of a concern, and these are concerns which have to be looked at. And corporations specifically, and I'm a strong believer in the private partner kind of an approach towards these issues, have got to play a very, very major role in not only assessing the security risk, but also doing their utmost to make sure that they play a role in going forward. And finally, equity, which is the creation of wealth, which has to happen in a way that benefits those who might be underprivileged and who may not be participating in the process right now. I think you've been hearing about farmers in India committing suicide and all that. I think that those are realities and they have to be addressed, and I'm glad to say that a lot of the emphasis of the finance ministry has been on creating provisions for loans and so on to be given to these farmers so that they do not fall into despair in case there is a loss of crop or whatever. But rural infrastructure is a very important thing. The opportunity for enterprise in villages, the focus on ensuring that there is a better availability to markets, which means today produce in a certain region of a rural part of India does not reach the markets in time and rots or gets bad, or prices get depressed because the farmer gets depressed prices. But because the availability is low, prices shoot up in the main market. So it's really a complex issue, but equity is at the heart of it. We have to make sure that communities that are contributing to the well-being of India on the whole are able to participate in the whole process. Now, I think I'm very privileged to belong to the Tata Group, which has a long history of being involved in ensuring the involvement of the communities with industrial development. And that's something that makes me feel very, very proud. And I'll give you a quick example. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the Tata Group, we have about 93 operating companies, over $25 billion US in top line. We account for about 3% of India's GDP. And we have a very, very strong emphasis on integrity, being innovative, and focusing on values and involving everybody in the growth and development of industry. So we play a strong role in the involvement of communities in what we do. And here is just an example. Just to give you an indication, 30% of the group's profits are plowed back into social causes. We actually involve ourselves in the community to the extent that we plow back a large proportion of our funds. And interestingly, Tata Sons, which is the holding company of the Tata Group, 66% of Tata Sons is owned by the Tata Trust, which are charitable trusts which plow back the money that they earn in dividends for the well-being of people, for women's empowerment, for health issues, for rural infrastructure, for water management, and so on and so forth. So I really believe that this is the way forward. These are the 5 challenges that we have to address, and there couldn't be a more appropriate forum than the Wilson Center to be talking about this, because quite honestly, I'm very inspired by the thoughts of the late President Woodrow Wilson, because it really does require sagacious leadership, wise leadership, and leadership that is able to not just think about a small nation or a large nation, but leadership that can think about the well-being of the entire planet and all those people who live in it. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again. I really appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bharat. That really gets us off to a great start for the morning. I'm going to use my position up here as the controller of the microphone to ask you to touch on one issue that you didn't mention, but I know that you've given it a great deal of thought, and that is the role of the Indian diaspora in the role the diaspora can play in and should play in and is playing in some of the developments you mentioned. There is a growing recognition in the United States about the new and quite impressive political role that the Indian American community is playing. My question is less politically oriented and is not necessarily meant to be restricted just to the Indian American community, but I would welcome your thoughts on how this worldwide diaspora can help India and the Indian population address some of these challenges you've mentioned.
Thanks, Bob. I think that's a very, very important question. I think one thing we need to appreciate, of course, is that wherever we have had people from different nations working and living in different countries, the diaspora has contributed to the well-being of these economies and nations. And this is, of course, an indication of the fact that they brought certain skills, they brought certain talents which have been able to be gainfully employed. After all, they left their own native lands for a certain set of reasons, but they had the talent and the skills which they could employ, and they have to, of course, be glad that they could use their skills in this new environment and make a difference. Coming to the point as to what they can do for the future, I think we really have to appreciate that there is a lot that they can do. First of all, I think they can help to keep the channels of communication open between let's say their native lands and the countries that they have chosen to make their own now after migrating, and therefore serve as a bridge. Because to my mind, many of the issues that we see in the world today are largely issues of people not being in a position to communicate freely and openly about a variety of issues. There are too many pulls and pressures, and I think for everybody to understand what can be done, I think the diaspora can really serve as a very, very important bridge. Whether it's the Chinese diaspora or the Indian diaspora, anywhere, people all over the world really have to play an active role in making sure that they serve as bridges between the host country and the lands that they come from originally. So I think that's to my mind a very, very major role. The other role that they have to play, of course, is to channelize investment in areas where it might not be channelized by, because it's either neglected or there's a shortage of funds and so on. To my mind, that's another very, very important area that needs to be given attention. But this is not an exhaustive list by any means. It's really up to the people to decide what they think could be a valuable area to make a contribution in. And within the ambit of some of these points, they can certainly make a big contribution.
Good. Now let's open it to those of you in the audience. I would ask you to do several things. Wait till we get a microphone to you, and introduce yourself, and keep your question and or comment very brief so that we can have the maximum time to hear from Bharat Wakhlu. Since the microphone is on this side, we'll start over here. Bhumika will have the gentleman in the second row here, and then we'll go to the back, and then Howard, I see your hand.
My name is Professor Kochanek from Penn State University. In the past, relations between business and government have not always been very close or harmonious. What is the current relationship between business and government in India, and what role does business play in formulating policy?
You mentioned that the relationship between business and government was not a good one. Maybe this is, of course, before the reform process. You're right. But I think once the reform process started, by and large, Indian industry has been quite well aligned with the government. And, of course, the view in business, of course, is that the government needs to do a bit more in terms of making it easy for investment to happen, make it easy for rules to be set and then not changed. I think one of the key issues really is that rules keep on changing in India. We have one set of rules today, and then maybe 10 months down the road we have another set of rules, and that completely alters the dynamic of how business gets done. But I think the relationship between the government and business is a very positive one, and the synergies are quite wholesome. And the reason is that I think the government now understands, I think that's part of the post-reform understanding, that the only way for the creation of wealth and for bringing people out of poverty is to emphasize investment in a variety of areas, and the government therefore has a vested interest in making sure that business feels completely at ease with making investments and deriving a fair rate of return for their investment. So to my mind, the relationship is a positive one, but you have to appreciate that a democracy is not just one big solid entity which behaves like a unified mass. At the regional level, you might have some politicians or some local leaders or even government functionaries and bureaucrats who might not be very pleased with what's going on. And let me give an example from the Tata Group. The Tata Group is setting up a plant in West Bengal in the region called Singur. And the panchayat was originally a little unhappy with the process that the government had adopted for land acquisition. So they obviously made a lot of noise, and a few local political leaders got into the fray. But once the panchayat was convinced, the political leader still continued her agitations because she was out to settle scores with the opposition chief minister in the same state. So there are levels where it seems that business is embroiled in issues with the government, but really it's not that at all. It's just that at the local level there are certain kinds of concerns which have to be addressed and which need therefore to be given a certain bit of attention. The other thing, of course, is that infrastructure, for instance, in the process of giving the bids, or once the tendering process is started, the time it takes for the government to conclude is often seen as being very protracted. And to my mind, that is also changing now because we have this right to information bill. It's making people ask questions, and the government has to respond. So to my mind, there's definitely a healthy kind of a collaboration in the whole thing. I'm not saying it's a smooth partnership. It can't be, because the objectives of government and the objectives of business are slightly at odds. But I think by and large, we all understand that economic activity is essential for the well-being of India and for the well-being of India's underprivileged people, and therefore it has to be supported by the government and business together.
In the back. Oh, Bill, sorry, I didn't recognize you without my glasses.
That's all right. I'm unrecognizable. I'm Bill Clark. A couple of questions. One of the things that all of us were struck with in past years about India was the Nehruvian model. The government entities on the heights and the Tatas and the rest in the valley, with size, restriction on size of entities and what have you. it also applied to electricity distribution within the states. How is it going, sort of unraveling all of this, which is difficult given the number of people employed and what have you?
Yeah.
Let me just interrupt very briefly to tell probably the handful of people who don't already know this, that Bill Clark was the U.S. ambassador in India a few years ago.
Yes. Ambassador Clark's point, of course, is that we started off with the Nehruvian model, which is really state-owned enterprises, the public sector enterprises being the prime movers for the economy. And I think, looking back at this model now, in hindsight, we can say it may not have been the best thing for India because it kind of slowed us down. But at the same time, if you were to, let's say, go back to 1947 and understand the kind of situation we were in then, I really feel that it was a very, very rational thing to do at that time. So I'm not here to pass judgment on that because to my mind, we really don't know the circumstances under which it was done. But looking at it now, it definitely seems to have been a slightly slow, very bureaucratic kind of thing. The license Raj prevented a lot of the entrepreneurs who are now showing their tremendous talents. They were all held back. Now, that has, of course, changed now. But there are still many areas where reform is required. And, of course, you very correctly mentioned, sir, that the state electricity boards need to be reformed because, quite honestly, today one of the big criticisms about India is that almost 40% of the power generated is stolen or lost. And that's a fact. And why is it stolen or lost? Because the state electricity boards don't have the clout to be able to retrieve the monies from the farmers and the relatively poor people who need the power to actually meet their requirements. So it's a tricky one. It's obviously the problem gets confounded because it's not merely an issue of reform. It's an issue of ensuring that the constituencies who have been benefiting with cheap power for many years or free power in some cases are told that there are no free lunches anymore. And this is what takes time. I think that really is the issue. But if I had a choice, I would still go with the slow, noisy, democratic way of doing things rather than imposing fiat like it's done in China, where 3 people can take a decision and you will have a brand new city. In India, 3,000 people will sit together and you will still not have a city for maybe 10 years. Because that's the nature of democracy. But if I were to decide, is democracy going to be allowed to get strengthened, or would you kind of go to a more centralized command situation? I'd say no. Democracy is noisy, it's dirty, it's painstakingly slow, but I'd rather stay with democracy. And I think that, ladies and gentlemen, is a challenge for all of us, because on the one hand, we need to make investments, we need them to be productive, we need them to be done quickly, but at the same time, we cannot allow that process to undermine a very, very fundamental way of Indian polity, which is democracy. And I think that is going to be the biggest strength as we go forward.
We'll have a young lady in the very back, and then Bhamika will come over to this side.
Thank you. My name is Nandini Kutty. I'm an independent consultant. I used to be in the Tata Administrative Service for 3 years, 1982 to 85, and I have enormous respect for your group and most of all also for Mr. Ratan Tata. My question is, Mohandas Gandhi many, many years ago offered a guideline for making policy in India. He said he would visualize the face of the most impoverished person in India, whom he called Daridra Narayan. And he said if the policy benefits him, then it's a good policy, we should go ahead with it, and not otherwise. So do you think that the current globalization policies in India meet this test?
You see, Nandini, thank you. First of all, since you were in the TAS, that makes you and me distant cousins, I guess. I'm also from the Tata Administrative Service, so it's good to know you. The point, Nandini, is that the issue is not whether globalization is good or not. I think we all have to understand that globalization, trade flows, the free flow of goods and services and capital and people included, the movement of people around the world is good for the world as a whole. The issue, and I think the really sore issue, is what happens to the people who are, let's say, affected by these processes, which means if you create wealth and the wealth is not uniformly distributed, then you might say, oh, this process is bad. But I'm saying no, the process is not bad. What is bad is the mechanisms available to us today for the equitable distribution of the wealth that is being created through globalization. So how would I respond to Mahatma Gandhi today? I would say, sir, what you're saying is true, but globalization will enable us to get many, many more people out of poverty. But we certainly have to safeguard that by making sure that we have the innovative capabilities available to us to spread the benefits of globalization far and wide. I think that really is the crux, and that's why when the Tata Group does involve itself in a lot of corporate social responsibility-oriented effort, it's because we genuinely believe that this is the way forward. It's not philanthropy, it's actually involvement. And I'm sure you know, Nandini, that there is a lot of volunteer work that goes hand in hand with disbursing funds to the underprivileged.
Howard? And then, Howard, if you'll just pass the mic when you're finished, just to your right.
I shall. My name is Howard Wiarda from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I write about comparative development on a global basis. Apropos of Bob Hathaway's question a minute ago, I can't resist telling you that when my son showed up as a first-year student at the Northwestern University Medical School, which is located in Chicago and which happens to be a major center for the Indian diaspora, half of the entering class of that medical school was of Indian family background, and my son quickly discovered this was very rough competition, which then turned out to be his best friend still in life. I wanted to ask you a question, however, about your presentation. You started off talking about how the world is interconnected. And please understand, this is not a criticism of your talk. I want to explore its broader dimensions. Because you started off with the notion the world is interconnected, but the only interconnectedness you mentioned was really China as a comparison in your initial presentation. And in some ways, you're a prisoner of the headlines in that regard, because in the world's press, India is always being compared to China on all kinds of different dimensions. But I wanted to explore this a little bit more broadly. That is, when you started off by saying India is a natural as a future global power economically and in other kinds of ways, and you mentioned vast coastlines and enormous minerals and steel wealth and an entrepreneurial people, and navigable rivers and so forth. You could just as easily have been talking about Brazil or Mexico or on a smaller scale Chile, all of whom have vast populations and emerging middle classes and access to global markets and so on. So maybe the best way to ask you about this is to ask you to tell us a little bit about how the Tata Group thinks of these other, what the World Bank used to call NICs, newly emerging, newly industrialized countries, but now we call BRICS, with Russia thrown in there as well, which have almost all of the same attributes as India. We used to refer to this as South-South relations, as you well know, and that, of course, meant poor countries dealing with other poor countries. But that doesn't really capture it anymore, because India has vast corporations like your own that's investing on a global basis and not on the basis of poverty or just resource exploration and so forth, but the export of computers and high tech and all kinds, as Brazil and Mexico are also doing. So I wonder, maybe from the perspective of Tata, if you would talk a little bit about how you or India, however you wish to approach this, think about these other vast, mineral-rich, oil-rich countries that are in many ways comparable to India and China in this regard, as future markets, as trading partners, in terms of political and international interconnections. It's a vast subject, but maybe approach it a little bit from how the Tata Group looks at potential in parts of the world that India has not historically thought very much about or traded with.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. Your question, of course, had two parts. The first part was that when I spoke about the world being an interconnected place, I may have inadvertently only focused on China and India. But I think what I really meant was that today you have a situation where value creation is actually happening across countless different national boundaries. Let me give a simple example. You might think that you're buying a car in the US. The steel for this car may have come from Japan. The iron ore for that steel may have come from Australia. The manpower used for making the forging may have come from India. The machinery to make that may have come from Switzerland. The funding may have come from a hedge fund in the US. And like that, if you look at all the connections, you will be amazed at how intricate is this web. Now, in this, political leaders would like us to believe that it is all within the nation. I'm afraid that's a very, very, it's a kind of a dissonant paradigm. So when we talk about globalization, I think this network of value creating opportunities across the entire globe is what it is that we have to preserve. Now, obviously, there are national repercussions. Just like I described in India, there are national repercussions in the US, and that's why Mr. Lou Dobbs is having such a big audience. But the fact is, the network of value creation cannot be sacrificed simply because there are pockets of problems around the world because of this. So that's I hope that point is made. The second point that you made, sir, was about how does the Tata Group look at these different regions. I think the Tata Group is in its strategy formulation. We are extremely open to investing in places where there are 2 or 3 distinct things that are happening. Number one, we would like to invest in nations where there is growing demand for certain kinds of goods or services. Number two, we want to leverage the fact that we have a very, very strong local base in India and Asia, which we would like to use to serve these economies. Now, what does that mean? What does a strong base mean? Let's look simply at a thing like labor and the arbitrage in labor. One average hourly worker in the US in the manufacturing sector earns $24. In India, an hourly worker for the same kind of an industry earns $1.2. Not because he's being underpaid. $1.2 in India is a lot of money, as Ambassador Clark would tell you. It buys you a lot. So it's not as if this person is underpaid and a lot of people are saying, hey, this is a sweatshop. Not at all. This labor difference is something which provides competitive advantage to companies that might wish to use this. So if Tata were to, say, sell in Brazil, A, there has to be demand for what we want to sell there or create infrastructure for or make investments in. And B, it has to be something which is sustainable over the long term and where we feel it ties up with our 7 verticals of business in which we are currently quite strong. So that is the logic that we are going to follow. But I think since you mentioned Brazil, Brazil is very much on our radar screen. We are in discussions with a number of companies there with government leaders there. We're in discussion in Chile. You mentioned this. Santiago is a very important hub for TCS. All the Ibero-American banking checks are processed by Tata in Santiago in Chile. So we are making a contribution where it is important to make, and we are very, very open. And today, quite honestly, the Tatas really reflect an Indian multinational company which understands this network of creating wealth across the world and trying to be as responsible, as ethical as is possible within the ambit of the regulations.
Hi, Leslie Hall, Treasury Department. The press around the recent SAARC conference highlighted relatively low economic ties in the South Asian region. And I just wanted to ask your view on India's role in that region.
That's a very valid point, and this links to the one of the concerns I cited in my presentation also about security. You know, there have been, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, there are certain little irritants or reasons for mistrust between neighbors in the South Asian region. For instance, Pakistan and India India and Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and India, Nepal and India. So unfortunately, India has, for a variety of reasons, been seen as the big player in this region. And some of the smaller nations kind of look at us suspiciously. But I think that's over now. The good news is that's over. I think everybody understands that good economics trumps politics. Because at the end of the day, when all is said and done, a political leader is also concerned, if he or she is a good political leader, is concerned about the well-being of the people whom he or she leads. So I think this understanding is now dawning, and we have a lot of good, sagacious people in that region who are talking to each other, thinking about, letting the difficult, intractable issues remain on the sidelines, even as we talk economics and collaboration and development. That's a very good thing, and I think India is playing a very strong role in that. Private companies are playing a strong role in that. Tata Consultancy Services has invested in Pakistan. Tatas have committed to invest $1 billion+ in Bangladesh, but the only problem is that Bangladesh is right now going through a bit of a rough patch, so we've been kind of holding back. And we are committed to making investments in the region where it makes economic sense and where we know it will benefit the region on the whole. So the private sector, along with governments, are already playing a role. And India definitely is very committed to giving a fillip to economic development. As I said, we are all very, very keen to have a safe, growing, developing South Asia, because that's good for everybody. You can't have an island of growth and everybody in a state of disarray around you. I'm afraid that model is not acceptable to India or to the entire world anymore.
I think we'll give the last question to Dennis Cooks, and then we're going to break for coffee after that. Should be. Oh, at the bottom.
Sorry.
Yeah.
There's a little switch on the bottom there.
Why don't you just go ahead and stand up, Dennis?
Dennis Cooks from the Woodrow Wilson Center. Maybe I could ask two questions.
If you want to keep people away from coffee.
One of the recent finance minister, when he was visiting Washington, was asked the question, "What's your biggest problem?" And he said, "The bureaucracy." What sort of a formula do you have for turning the red tape, backward-looking, etc., Indian bureaucracy writ large into a group of individuals that look for results, that want to solve problems? That's the first question. Second question is about restrictive labor laws in India. This is said to be one of India's big problems, holding back development, etc., because if you hire somebody, you can't fire them, etc. How does Tata deal with that? Because you have 93 companies and you must face that.
Yes.
For those who might not have been able to hear, particularly in those watching the website, two questions, one having to do with bureaucracy and red tape and the impediments that has traditionally represented, the other pertaining to India's restrictive labor laws and how has Tata dealt with these.
These are, obviously, both these points are very, very relevant and crucial for India's growth. So let me start off with the first one. How do we change the bureaucracy? There is a very simple mantra which I believe strongly in. And that mantra has been around for thousands of years. It's called the carrot and the stick mantra. Now, what does that really mean? What gets measured usually gets done. Which means if we are able to ensure that bureaucrats are measured not in terms of how long they sit on files or how wordy their comments, but instead we assess them on performance and reward them on performance, you will see a change. Now, why is it not happening? Because the Indian bureaucracy, like the British bureaucracy and probably the American bureaucracy, I don't know, is extremely well entrenched. And they are able to, and they know that the government changes after every 3 or 4 years, so they have a kind of a stranglehold on the government and aren't able to, no one has the guts so far to kind of shake it up. But it's going to happen with increasing transparency, with more e-governance. We are actually giving more power to the people. People are demanding questions, and thanks to a free press, thanks to television, people are now aware that these people, some of them are good and some of them are not so good, and the differences are there for everyone to see. To my mind, sir, that's going to be a very, very major incentive for people to change. So that's part number one. Part number two is about the restrictive labor laws. Quite honestly, I have worked in India for close to 20 plus years, and I work in the industry. I've dealt with unions, I've dealt with communities, and I have never had a problem to fire a guy. And I've fired many people in my life. What I have done, however, is I have always been extremely genuine about firing people. I have never fired somebody just because I didn't like his face. So I don't think this is an issue at all. Yes, the unions will demand answers from you. They will demand that you got to be, why is this person not being, why is he being expelled? Have you gone through the process of due diligence? Have you done the charge sheeting? When was the charge sheeting done? You know, when I read the New York Times, I see the same questions being asked here, and I'm delighted that's how it is. So if I were to put a prism and say, no, it's very difficult to change anything in America, I'd be totally wrong. It's all part of the democratic process. And frankly, I have worked on the shop floor, I have worked in management, I have never had a problem to sack a person who has been working contrary to the well-being of the corporation or the community. I have sacked many people, including people for drunkenness at the workplace. Something as simple as that. So when people tell me it's restrictive, what they really mean is they don't have the patience to talk to the unions or talk to the labor officer. It's just that. People have got to get used to the idea that democracy is going to be slow and painstaking, but there are no shortcuts. And that's it. And the Tata Group has been doing just that. We've been doing it for 150 years. And another interesting point, Tata Steel has one of India's strongest and most well-known unions, the Tata Workers Union, the TWU. And the TWU has never struck work in India, in eastern India, where we have our steel plant, for a labor-related matter for the past 75 years. So I really don't understand why this is such an issue. If you genuinely have an issue, I'm sure there are many, many ways to go about it. Yes, I do agree that the Factories Act, which was originally prepared in the 1800s, at a time when industry was exploitative, at that time, some of the provisions were essentially made to prevent exploitation, like having water in the workplace, not kicking out a workman arbitrarily. But that has changed. We've come a long way. Today we are in an era where everybody has recourse to unions, to the labor ministry, to labor tribunals. There's a plethora of institutions created as a result of our democratic orientation, which helps everybody. So I don't buy this argument really, although it does figure very prominently in all the reports that we see about India. But I have and I think I speak from experience, we have a little different view about the whole thing.
Well, I see a number of other hands, but I think that if I don't bring this to a close, we might keep Mr. Wakhlu here all morning. So we will close. Join me, if you will, in expressing our appreciation to Bharat and Wakhlu for getting us off to a terrific start this morning.
Thanks.
We're now going to have a brief adjournment of 15, perhaps 20 minutes. Our next speaker is Undersecretary of Commerce, Frank Lavin. He has a very tight schedule, so as soon as he gets here, we're going to want to start. So when you get the word inviting you to come back in, I'd appreciate it if you'd do so expeditiously.